You did a really good video, actually, where you were analyzing Zohran Mamdani and comparing him to Trump, because there are kind of similarities, aren't there, believe it or not?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's why he's so triggering to a lot of people on the right, because he is Trump's foil. He's a populist. That's why Trump was ascendant to begin with, because he had an instinct or an ability to actually listen to and understand the issues of the common person. And what's going on in New York? Well, you have this multi-ethnic, multi-religious coalition building around Zohran, because he's able to say, yeah, affordability is a big issue, and corporatized capitalism in New York is not actually serving people there. And he's even able to speak with specificity about stuff like people having concerns about noise or parking, illegal parking on their streets. That's something that you can only point out if you're actually in touch with the will and the issues of the people. So he's the populist left, whereas Trump was the populist right. And then you can layer on these other identities like socialist versus capitalist and so on. But I don't think most people, they're that attached to any economic system, frankly. I don't think people think, oh yeah, socialism's a solution. They just hear a guy who talks about the things that they're actually experiencing and they resonate with that. And he's also a really smart strategic politician, because he's counterpositioned himself against Trump. And if you're a Democrat, that's one of the smartest things you can do right now.
Absolutely. And also what's really interesting about Zohran is that he, like you said, he's talking about the things that really motivate people. And this is what people on the right, I don't think, understand, is that New York is experiencing real difficulties around affordability. And whether you think he's going to do it or if he can't deliver, it's kind of irrelevant. He looks like he could to a lot of people who feel that they've been ignored by the system, which is, again, quite Trumpian, isn't it?
Yeah, and what's the alternative, right? Like, it's basically a one-party state. You have Andrew Cuomo, who resigned. You have Curtis Sliwa, who's a Republican. And Andrew Cuomo even lost the primary. So if you think from a New Yorker's shoes, if you're a New Yorker and you see that you're paying $4,500 a month for rents, and you see that the field is composed of a bunch of people who are either Republican or disgraced former governors, and then you have Zohran Mamdani who's talking about the stuff that you experience on a day-to-day basis, what are you going to choose? So I have my concerns about what he opens up the Overton window to allow, like even more far-left policies, and people have complained or been concerned about Islamic extremism. I think there's a healthy discussion to have about some of Zohran's associations there. But the solution is not to name call and demonize him further. The solution is to understand him, speak in the way that he is speaking to his audience, but offer a different solution. But if you just demonize him and then you demonize anyone who follows him, or you dismiss them as stupid, well, they're going to be polarized against you even further. So I think there's a massive strategic error that I see the right committing in their prosecution of Zohran and everything he stands for.
And this is so interesting, because these people made the exact same mistake with Trump.
Yes.
And you're just going like, dude, you're using the same tactics the left use against Trump, and it only made it worse. Because the thing that Zohran has, whether you, like I said, I don't agree with his economic policies. I think ultimately they're going to lead to a disaster. But he's a great communicator, he's charismatic, and he's funny. Just like Trump. You saw him on the on Andrew Schultz's Flagrant podcast. He smashed it.
Yeah, he was impressive. And I like that you said that the people are committing the same error that was committed against Trump. Let's look at what Trump was called: a fascist, a white supremacist, all these labels that are pretty much just political swear words. Like, I think the average person, when they say fascist, they don't actually have a way of defining what fascist is. And I think a better term is he's a nationalist, Trump. But you can always take something that you consider bad and make it sound even worse. Same thing with Zohran. He's an avowed democratic socialist. Maybe he's secretly a communist. I don't know what is in his mind. I can't read minds. I can read words. He said he's a democratic socialist. Engage him there. Show why democratic socialism is an untenable economic model, as opposed to calling him a communist. And if you have concerns about Islamism or radical extremism or Sharia law being brought to New York, then yeah, you should be specific about, okay, I don't like how he's associated with this imam that he took a picture with, for example. That specifically is my issue. Not say something like, well, he's Muslim and that's bad, and all Muslims are extremists who want to take over America. It just doesn't resonate with people who are certainly in the Team Zohran camp, or people who are more moderates and open to a variety of different viewpoints.
Well, the one area I don't kind of agree with the discussion you guys are having is, I think that, and this isn't evidence of my right-leaning bias, just a factual matter. When you look at President Trump, the things that people said about him, the mistakes they made, are exactly the same. But the difference, I think, is, yes, he was speaking to people's concerns, but he had a credible plan for addressing those concerns. So, for example, if you are concerned about the open border, he had a plan which he's now implementing. We can argue about what, the way that it's being done. But in terms of effectiveness, it's there, right? Whether, if you talk about offshoring of jobs, he is now doing a lot to try and bring jobs back to America. With Zohran Mamdani, he is addressing people's concerns, but the solutions that he's offering verifiably do not work. And that, to me, is a big difference.
Which specific policies?
So if your policy effectively is to give people free stuff as a solution to affordability, that is not a sustainable model for running anything, right? You have to, for example, if it's housing, you have to create more housing. Giving people a rent freeze doesn't work because there'll be some other way to hike up prices in a place where demand massively outstrips supply. Do you see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying, and now I have to be the guy who takes the devil's advocacy position.
Yeah,
it's not fun because I do fundamentally disagree with Zohran's worldview. But just to steelman him for a second.
Sure.
I think a lot of the time people they see socialists and then they see the headlines for what he's proposing and they say this is unworkable. And I disagree with the worldview. Like, there's no successful socialist country on earth. People say Scandinavian nations, no, those are capitalist systems with strong social safety nets. They're not the same thing. But if I look at some of the specific policies that he's proposing, like, for example, he wants to have a rent freeze while also reducing the cost on the landlord side by addressing, why is insurance so high? What are all these building codes and housing laws that are making it expensive and difficult to build housing? How do we incentivize both public housing, but also private industry to create more housing? There's a logic there. There's an internally consistent logic there. And part of it is just he needs to raise like $9 to $11 billion to fund this. So if he gets the governor on board and they just raise taxes on the rich and they find the point in the curve where they can raise taxes enough to make more money but not scare them all away, it can work in theory. So there are certain individual policies that he has that I think there's a part of the spectrum where they actually can work. My concern is more of the democratic socialist worldview in general, because the whole idea of democratic socialism is they're going to try to control the means of production. That's the end goal. And you can say it's democratically, like people vote on nationalized healthcare or nationalized energy systems or whatever. But I think that centralizing control of private industry is inefficient, and it consistently has been shown not to work, especially in the Western system. Yeah, so I agree with that. But even here, what I challenge people to do who are critical of Zohran is say, let's talk about specific policies, assess whether they work, give credit where credit's due. Like, I think he has some reasonable ideas. Like, okay, maybe we need some mental health workers in the mix to deal with a guy who's muttering on the subway, as opposed to sending a cop there. It's like, okay, I'm open to that, but please also be willing to increase the police force if that's needed. But I'm open to some of this. But the overall worldview that he represents, I don't think works. And I think someone should just ask him the simple question, can you give me an example of a democratic socialist country that exists today that's been successful? And he can't produce that. And there you would probably get into some sort of very theoretical description of why it should work. And I think that's actually where he'd be most vulnerable. Because I don't think his association with the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, has been scrutinized enough. Actually, like, why is this guy giving part of his salary to these people? What does that reflect about his worldview? You go to the DSA website, it's extreme. Man, they have a very racialized worldview. It's a very hostile, grievance-based agenda. And I think if people focus strategically on that would actually be a much more vulnerable point where I think he would be much more likely to show that yeah, he might have some policies that could work in the short term, but he's introducing a worldview that doesn't work in the long term.
Isn't that somewhat contradictory to the conversation we had so far? Because ultimately, it's about addressing the concerns that people have, whereas saying he's a democratic socialist is not that far off saying he's a communist, because those two things are not far off from each other, just in terms of the policies that those two groups advocate, right? Mm-hmm. See what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying.
Do you think a significant portion of Zohran's audience would be horrified to find out that he believes in the redistribution of wealth at a higher level than they currently do, or whatever?
Well, if you looked at the DSA's platform, I think people would be horrified to see some of the excerpts from that platform.
Really? Like what?
Look, starting a business is exciting, but it isn't easy. It's not just logos, merch, and big ideas. It's late nights, awkward first sales, and wondering if your bank balance is going to survive until Friday. That's why having the right tools from day one makes all the difference. Enter Shopify. Shopify powers millions of businesses around the world, from big names like Mattel and Gymshark to people just getting started on their kitchen table. It gives you hundreds of beautiful website templates, built-in marketing tools, even AI that'll help you write product descriptions, which, let's face it, we could have used for TRIGGERnometry back in 2018. Plus, did I mention that iconic purple Shop Pay button used by millions of businesses around the world? It's why Shopify has the best converting checkout on the planet. Your customers already love it. Turn your big business idea into with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.co.uk/trigger. Go to shopify.co.uk/trigger. One more time, that's shopify.co.uk/trigger.
So one thing they talk about is ending white supremacy. Like that's like a big part of their platform. And I remember when I read that, I was like, oh wow, these people, like, they're fomenting more racial division.
But isn't that a mainstream left-wing position in this country, that that's what needs to happen? Am I wrong? I'm not American, so I don't know. I'm just asking.
I don't think it's as mainstream as you think, at least not in such explicit terms. I mean, this is literally in their website. They constantly talk about this. And maybe you guys, I don't know if you heard the headline where Zohran talks about attaching richer, whiter neighborhoods. Like that's literally a part of his platform, I believe still. You can go to the PDF and check it out. I think that's a product of the democratic socialist worldview. It very much views things from an oppressor-oppressed lens and explicitly views things in terms of racial dynamics, which I think is unhealthy.
No, I agree, but I guess what I'm saying is, as far as I could tell as an outside observer, the Democratic Party has been saying those things for the last 10 years.
I don't think...
Is that wrong?
I think the woke left, which is still relatively, it's a relative minority, does talk about that stuff a lot. I don't think the moderate Democrats and like the Andrew Cuomo's of the world talk about that. You're not going to hear Gavin Newsom talking about racial dynamics. I think they tend to avoid it. And I think now when we talk about the slippery slope concern, it's that Zohran, and again, it's in his platform talking about richer, whiter neighborhoods, is now shifting the Overton window toward racializing the problems that we have. And that, along with, I think, the socialist worldview more generally, is stuff that I think people should apply pressure on.
And what's interesting about Zohran is that it's opened up the discussion to talk about anti-Semitism now related to Israel. Like, I don't really want to focus on Israel particularly, but what I do want to focus on is how Jewish people in New York say they're now worried about Zohran and the election of Zohran, that they're going to become targets, etc. Do you think that there's any credible, how can I say, there's any big credible basis to these worries, or do you think it's akin to people worrying about that Trump's going to come in and all of a sudden, black people, I saw one of your videos, your hairdresser said that they worried that she was going to be in chains, for example.
Yeah, 100% I think it's a concern. Not because of what Zohran is saying, but because of who he's affiliated with. Because again, there was that picture of him with that imam, right? This was an imam who literally has defended multiple terrorists, one in court and one by raising a legal defense fund for him. So whether Zohran is sympathetic to the views of that individual is one thing, but what we know is that he's comfortable aligning himself with people who actually defend extremists. So if I see that, again, if we talk about like, what are you not open to? You're open to taking a picture with an imam and calling him a pillar of the community without explicitly acknowledging the really messed up things that he's done in the past. So I don't think that's an irrational concern that Jewish New Yorkers have. And I think it's something that Zohran should have to explicitly answer for, because he gets kind of evasive when he's pressured on these things. For example, in the Andrew Schulz interview, that I forget who brought it up, Andrew Schulz brings up that topic and he says, well, Eric Adams and Bill de Blasio campaigned with that same imam. Like, what's the big deal? And that's actually misleading. It's highly misleading, because what happened was, I think it was Bloomberg actually met that imam and he didn't realize what his background was. And then after, he said he regretted the meeting. Eric Adams met that imam alongside a Jewish community leader and a Christian community leader. Neither of those interactions were like taking a picture arm in arm with a guy who defended terrorists. So look, I get that Zohran, as a Muslim, probably he wants to show solidarity with the Muslim community in New York, and it's a tricky needle to thread. But at the same time, when you bring extremists into the tent, there's concerns from other people in the tent that now you're going to allow in more extremist views. So if people were to say just because he's Muslim, this is a problem, I would say, hey, that's actually not being fair. But when you look at the people he's actually associating himself with, yeah, there's a reasonable concern. I mean, same thing with Hassan Piker, right? Hassan Piker, he said that America deserved 9/11. And yeah, afterward, he said, kind of apologized for it. But it's like, okay, if you're going to align yourself with someone like that, then people are going to have concerns. Hey, do you actually agree with this guy? Or is this someone who you're friends with and you agree with some of what they said and not others? At least in the case of Hassan, he's denounced those comments by Hassan. But in the case of the imam, he kind of just deflected. And that's not what we need a leader doing when, positioning yourself with people who are explicitly sympathizing with terrorists.
And that's the real concern, because you look at America, and I'm a foreigner here and all the rest of it, but I do worry that this current polarization is just going to continue happening. And now that you see it in New York with Jewish people saying that they're openly scared, they're openly talking about leaving, and you're kind of thinking to yourself, where will this end? Where will this end, and how will this end? Because we can't keep going on this trajectory without something significant happening.
Yeah. I had actually hoped that it would end when Trump nearly got assassinated. It didn't end there. I hoped it would end when Charlie Kirk got assassinated. Didn't end there either. And I think there's two paths we can take. One is the more pessimistic path, where there's sufficient violence that causes the leaders on both sides to find the courage to say, hey, enough, and critique their side directly, which is what I think people need to be doing. Like, followers take cues from leaders, and if leaders are never critiquing their followers are not going to change. The optimistic path is that some people realize that the temperature has been turned up way too high and they start turning it down. And I'm trying to do that to the extent that I can. That's kind of why I try to do stuff like steelman Zohran Mamdani's position, just to humanize the sides to one another. And I think that can work. And I don't think you need everyone to do it at once. I think you just need the most visible leaders with the biggest followings to start doing that and be willing to take the heat for it. Because look, if I make a video steel manning Zohran Mamdani, I do not go viral. It just doesn't end up as well. And it's like, yeah, it sucks. And I also get criticism and people misunderstand me, but I also think it's really important. And I also think there's a core of my audience and any influencer or leader's audience who does see that and respects you when you do it. So yeah, the applause is not going to be loud, but there are going to be people who's like, yeah, politics aside, this is kind of crazy. And I'm glad that someone is calling this out and just trying to not have some continuous moral crusade against everyone they disagree with.